In 1941, the city of Newport, Kentucky had more casinos than Las Vegas. About 40 of them crammed into roughly 3 square miles. The carpet joints had crystal chandeliers. The bust-out joints had sawdust on the floor. There were slot machines in the candy store across the street from the 9th grade school, slot machines in the chili parlors, slot machines in the back of barber shops. Dean Martin dealt blackjack at the finest club in town. Frank Sinatra gambled in the back rooms on York Street. And none of it, not a single card game, not a single pull of a single lever, was legal. Gambling has never been legal in the state of Kentucky, but for the better part of 4 decades, Newport, Kentucky was the gambling capital of the United States. And the men who built it into that would go on, when it all fell apart, to build another city in a desert, a city that would steal Newport's old nickname and make it famous. They called that city Las Vegas. But before there was Las Vegas, there was this, a small town on the south bank of the Ohio River, directly across the water from Cincinnati, sitting at the spot where the Licking River empties into the Ohio. 3 square miles. You could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. It was founded around 1791 by James Taylor, Jr., a man who'd been given the land for his family's service in the Revolutionary War. He named it not for the river or the port, but for Captain Christopher Newport, who'd commanded the first English ship to reach Jamestown in 1607. That gesture toward the earliest days of American colonization would prove oddly fitting. Newport, Kentucky would spend the next 2 centuries as a kind of frontier, not a geographic one, but a moral one, the place where the rules ended and the river began. The town was formally established on December 14, 1795, and incorporated as a city in 1834. In 1803, the military post at Fort Washington, across the river in Cincinnati, was relocated to Newport, and the Newport Barracks became a permanent garrison. That decision planted the seed of everything that followed. You had soldiers, young men, far from home, with money in their pockets and nothing to do at night. Businesses materialized to serve them, saloons, boarding houses, and, quietly at first, brothels. By the time of the Civil War, with Union troops streaming through, a prostitution industry was operating more or less openly in the blocks around the barracks. Newport's relationship with vice was not an accident or an aberration. It was a business model, and it was there from the start. By the late 19th century, waves of German immigrants had settled in Newport and across northern Kentucky, bringing with them a deep fondness for beer, social clubs, and lottery games. The culture was convivial, tolerant, and not particularly interested in moral crusades. Newport grew steadily. By the 1900 census, the city had a population of over 28,000, making it the 3rd largest city in Kentucky, behind Louisville and neighboring Covington, though both Newport and Covington were, in practical terms, extensions of Cincinnati's economy. The commercial spine of Newport was Monmouth Street, a busy corridor of shops, restaurants, and meeting halls. It was a respectable enough place, solidly built, a city of brick row houses and German social halls and churches. Nothing about it at the turn of the century suggested what it was about to become. Newport was also, it bears noting, a working city. The Andrews Steel Company operated a mill that employed a significant share of the town's labor force. In 1921, more than 2,000 workers went on strike, roughly 1 in 5 working residents, and the company responded by arming the mill with machine guns. State militia companies were dispatched. Tanks, actual Army tanks, rolled down Brighton Street. The strike dragged on for years, not fully settled until 1928. It was the kind of labor dispute that could define a city's identity for a generation. In Newport, it barely registers as a footnote. The steel strike isn't what Newport is remembered for. What Newport is remembered for started 2 years earlier with a single piece of legislation. On October 28, 1919, the United States Congress passed the Volstead Act, providing for the enforcement of prohibition the nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The act went into effect in January 1920, and almost immediately, a man named George Remus saw an opportunity that would reshape Newport forever. Remus was a Chicago defense attorney, brilliant, flamboyant, and profoundly greedy. He'd spent years defending bootleggers, and he noticed two things. His clients were making extraordinary amounts of money, and they were doing it stupidly. Remus studied the Volstead Act with the precision of the lawyer he was, and he found a loophole wide enough to drive a fleet of trucks through. The act permitted the manufacture and sale of alcohol for medicinal purposes. So Remus moved to Cincinnati, married his second wife in Newport in June 1920, and set about building the largest bootlegging operation in the country. He bought distilleries, actual licensed distilleries, starting with the Fleischmann Distillery, which he acquired for $197,000, along with 3,100 gallons of bonded whiskey. He purchased wholesale pharmaceutical companies. He obtained government withdrawal permits that allowed him to legally remove bourbon from bonded warehouses. And then he arranged for his own men to hijack his own trucks and sell the whiskey on the black market. Remus had recognized something about the geography. Roughly 80% of all the bourbon in the United States was manufactured and stored within 300 miles of Cincinnati. He was sitting on top of the largest reserve of whiskey in the country. In less than 3 years, with about 3,000 people working for him, Remus made an estimated $40 million, somewhere between $300 and $400 million in today's terms. He threw lavish parties at his mansion in the Cincinnati suburbs, giving away brand new cars as party favors. Some believe he was the inspiration for Jay Gatsby. But what matters for Newport's story is what happened around Remus. The money his operation generated did not stay in his pockets alone. It rippled outward. Small towns near Cincinnati, and Newport above all, became what one historian called drinking towns, where saloons and speakeasies, called tiger blinds in local slang, appeared on seemingly every block. And where there were speakeasies, there were soon gamblers, opening small casinos in back rooms to entertain patrons who had already decided the law was a suggestion. Newport's position was perfect. A separate state from Ohio, a separate set of politicians to corrupt, and a bridge ride away from Cincinnati's population of paying customers. The Ohio River wasn't just a geographic feature. It was a business moat. A man could cross from Cincinnati to Newport in 5 minutes and enter a different legal universe, one where the police chief was on someone's payroll, and the city commissioners didn't ask questions because their campaigns had been funded by the answers. Remus himself fell spectacularly. Convicted of Volstead Act violations in 1925, he went to prison. While he was locked up, his wife took up with a Prohibition agent named Franklin Dodge, and together they liquidated Remus's fortune and vanished. When Remus got out, he chased his wife's taxi through Cincinnati's Eden Park and shot her dead in front of their daughter. He defended himself at trial, pleaded temporary insanity, and was acquitted. He died in 1952, living quietly in a boarding house in Covington, just a few miles from the empire he'd built and lost. But by the time Remus went to prison, his operation had already created the infrastructure, the corrupt officials, the willing police, the paying clientele, the physical spaces, that a far more organized and far more dangerous group would inherit. They came from Cleveland. They were called the Cleveland Four, and their names were Mo Dalitz, Morris Kleinman, Louis Rothkopf, and Sam Tucker. During Prohibition, they'd run what was known as the Little Jewish Navy, a fleet of speedboats that smuggled Canadian whiskey across Lake Erie at night, guided by a system of red and green lights on the shore. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Dalitz and his partners needed a new source of income. They found it in Newport. The Cleveland Four did not arrive politely. Their method of acquisition was blunt. They took over the Coney Island racetrack, the major horse track serving the Cincinnati market, by, according to multiple accounts, having the owner murdered. They renamed it River Downs. They acquired Latonia Park, a dog track in Florence, and converted it to horse racing. And then they turned their attention to the casinos. The first man who said no to them was Pete Schmidt. Schmidt was a former henchman of George Remus, who'd used his bootlegging profits to open the Beverly Hills Club, a gambling establishment just south of Newport in the small town of Southgate. Schmidt had ambitions. He wanted to build something grand, a place that would draw high-rolling clientele from across the Midwest. The Cleveland Four wanted a piece of it, or all of it. Schmidt refused. On February 3, 1936, the Beverly Hills Club burned to the ground. The fire killed a young woman, the niece of the property's caretaker. She was, as one historian noted, the first casualty of the mob's campaign to take over northern Kentucky. Schmidt, to his credit, was not easily discouraged. By April 1937, he had rebuilt the Beverly Hills, this time as the Beverly Hills Country Club, and he opened it with a party attended by governors from 4 states. The new club was a palace: crystal chandeliers, oak paneling, plush blue carpet, gilded wallpaper. It was, in the words of its own matchbook advertising, the showplace of the nation. But Schmidt's defiance couldn't last. A group of armed men robbed the club shortly after it reopened. He sought protection from a rival syndicate in Toledo. They wanted nothing to do with a war against Dalitz. Eventually, the Cleveland Four got what they wanted. By 1940, they controlled the Beverly Hills and nearly every major gambling operation in the region. Not every operator had to be burned out. Jimmy Brink, who ran a place called the Lookout House, a casino and restaurant perched on a hill with a sweeping view of the Cincinnati skyline, accepted the syndicate's terms: $125,000, a 10% ownership stake in both the Lookout House and the Beverly Hills Club, and the title of general manager. It was, by the standards of the era, a polite transaction. Others were not so lucky. Buck Brady, who ran the Primrose Club on Licking Pike, lost his casino when the syndicate offered him, as one source put it, his life for the deed. They remodeled the Primrose and renamed it the Latin Quarter. That building, incidentally, still stands today. It's a country music bar called Bobby Mackey's, and it's said to be haunted. By the early 1940s, Newport had entered its golden age, or its most profitable era of corruption, depending on your perspective. Monmouth Street was lined with neon. There were 2 kinds of gambling establishments, and the distinction mattered. The bust-out joints were small, dingy, locally owned, and almost always rigged in favor of the house. The carpet joints, so called because they actually had carpet on the floor instead of wood and sawdust, were the syndicate's crown jewels: fair odds, fine food, professional entertainment, and waitresses in evening attire. The distinction was not merely aesthetic, it was economic. The bust-out joints took money from suckers. The carpet joints cultivated repeat customers, wealthy men from Cincinnati and Louisville who came back week after week because the experience was worth the drive. The violence, when it surfaced, could be sudden. On the evening of February 18, 1946, a man named Rip Farley, one of 2 brothers who'd come from the hills of eastern Kentucky to work in Newport's underworld, walked into the Yorkshire Club, pulled a pistol, and robbed a dealer of $2,500. The Yorkshire was run by the Cleveland Four. 4 days later, as Rip and his brother Taylor were leaving the Flamingo Club at 633 York Street at 4 in the morning, a man in a large black car shot them both with a sawed-off shotgun. Rip died almost immediately. Taylor survived. The Flamingo was a mob joint, and the Farleys should probably not have been loitering in front of it at that hour. The next morning, a newspaper rounded up a group of newsboys and sent them in a truck to Newport to sell a special edition. The headline: Farley Boy Wiped Out in Newport. The carpet joints, though, were where the real story was. The Beverly Hills Country Club hosted Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, Nat King Cole, and Sam Cooke. Marilyn Monroe visited. Duke Ellington played. The smaller joints were rougher, but they were everywhere. The Yorkshire Club on York Street was a three-story brick building with a 7,500-square-foot casino on the first floor and a sports book in the back. The Sportsman's Club, run by a local enforcer named Frank "Screw" Andrews, grossed approximately $1.6 million a year, over $7 million in today's money. Andrews earned his nickname honestly. He was suspected of multiple murders and was a leading suspect in at least 2 shooting deaths in Newport. His preferred method of disposing of enemies, according to local lore, was called the Newport nightgown. He would wrap the victim in chains, attach a concrete block, and throw them off the suspension bridge into the Ohio River. The entire city operated on a system of mutual benefit that everyone understood and almost no one discussed openly. It was, in the language of organized crime, an open city, a place where the syndicate operated with the tacit consent of the government and where competing interests were tolerated as long as they paid their respects and their percentages. The arrangement was so well known that The Godfather Part II would later include a reference to the mob's operations across the river from Cincinnati. The mob kept the streets clean, the entertainment first-rate, and the violence mostly out of sight. The police kept their eyes closed and their wallets open. The city commissioners approved budgets funded by revenues that flowed directly and indirectly from illegal enterprises. The ordinary businesses, the chili parlors, the dry cleaners, the barber shops on Monmouth Street, thrived on the foot traffic that the casinos generated. Thousands of people crossed the river from Cincinnati every weekend, and they didn't just gamble. They ate, they drank, they bought things. Newport's legitimate economy was parasitic on its illegitimate one, and everyone knew it, and the city hummed. There were, it should be said, periodic reform efforts. Every few years, a minister or a civic group or a newspaper editorial would demand a crackdown. Occasionally, a grand jury would be convened. In 1939, a so-called Blue Ribbon grand jury returned 196 indictments. Nothing much came of them. In 1951, the issue went national. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee chaired the Senate Special Committee to investigate crime in interstate commerce, which held televised hearings in 14 cities. An estimated 30 million Americans tuned in. Newport came to the committee's attention during hearings in Cleveland, when testimony revealed that the Cleveland Syndicate had extensive casino interests in northern Kentucky. The committee subpoenaed Newport's chief of police, George Google, and the testimony became one of the most quoted passages in the history of organized crime investigations. The committee counsel pointed out that Cincinnati newspapers openly ran advertisements for gambling establishments in Newport. Was the chief aware of this? The chief said he was not. The counsel asked if the chief was truly the only man in the entire vicinity who didn't know that any taxi driver in town could take a customer to a choice of 5 or 6 gambling joints within minutes. Chief Google replied that he had never in his life ridden in a taxi. The Kefauver hearings embarrassed Newport nationally, but they did not close a single casino. The syndicate was sophisticated enough to create a phony reform group, the Newport Civic Association, that ran candidates on a platform of clean up, not close up. The idea was elegant in its cynicism. The NCA obligingly shut down a few of the seediest bust-out joints, the rig dives with the worst reputations, which had the convenient effect of eliminating the syndicate's competition while making it look like reform was happening. The NCA candidates won. The bust-out joints closed. The carpet joints, the ones making real money for Dalitz and his partners, continued to operate unmolested. By the end of 1951, the NCA had served its purpose and was quietly disbanded. A Cleveland enforcer named Red Masterson had discreetly funded the whole operation. The gambling went on. In the 1950s, Newport added its own Tropicana, its own Stardust, its own Silver Slipper, names borrowed from Las Vegas, as if the little Kentucky city were trying to keep up with its own offspring. But forces were converging. The Kefauver hearings had put national law enforcement on alert. The syndicate itself was beginning to lose interest in Newport. Las Vegas, where gambling was legal, was growing rapidly, and the profits there were larger and the legal risk non-existent. The talent was migrating, and in Newport itself, a genuine reform movement was coalescing, driven by Protestant and Catholic leaders who had finally set aside decades of mutual distrust. They called themselves the Committee of 500. By 1961, their membership had swelled to 2,500. What they needed was a candidate for Campbell County Sheriff, someone clean, Catholic, likable, and famous enough that the mob couldn't simply make him disappear. They found George Ratterman. Ratterman was almost absurdly well cast for the role. He was a former quarterback at Notre Dame, part of the 1946 National Championship team, and had played professionally for the Buffalo Bills, the New York Yanks, and the Cleveland Browns. Frank Leahy, the legendary Notre Dame coach, had called him the greatest all-around athlete in the school's history. By 1961, Ratterman was 34 years old, the married father of 8 children, and working as a stockbroker and part-time sports broadcaster in Fort Thomas, a suburb of Newport. He announced his candidacy in April 1961, saying, "I am told that if I run for sheriff, I will be the victim of all sorts of personal, slanderous attacks. But I say to our opponents, let the attacks start now." They started within a month. On the evening of May 8, 1961, Ratterman met with Tito Carinci, a former Xavier University football player who managed the Glen Hotel and its attached casino, the Tropicana, at a bar in Cincinnati. Carinci had contacted Ratterman the day after his candidacy announcement, claiming he wanted to provide information about the mob. They had one drink. Ratterman later said he remembered almost nothing after that. He remembered feeling groggy. He remembered wanting to lie down. He remembered someone pulling at his clothes. At 2:45 in the morning on May 9, 1961, 3 Newport detectives, including the chief of detectives, burst into room 314 of the Glen Hotel. They found Ratterman in his boxer shorts and socks, in bed with a 26-year-old stripper whose stage name was April Flowers. Her real name was Juanita Hodges. Ratterman was arrested and charged with breach of the peace, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest. The story hit the newspapers that morning. The frame-up was clumsy. A blood test revealed a triple dose of chloral hydrate in Ratterman's system. Enough, the Hamilton County coroner said, to have killed a less physically robust man. The zipper on Ratterman's pants had been ripped out. As he pointed out in a television interview the next day, he did not normally tear the zipper off his own pants when undressing. A surprise witness at the subsequent trial confirmed that Ratterman had been drugged and carried to the room. The charges were dropped. Carinci, who denied everything on camera, telling a reporter, "He got caught, he's human like anybody else," was widely believed to have orchestrated the setup on behalf of the gambling interests. Hundreds packed the courtroom every day of the trial. The overflow filled the hallway. A local television station provided one of the area's first live remote broadcasts from the proceedings. For 3 weeks, it was the biggest story in the region. The scheme did not merely fail, it detonated. The botched frame-up generated a wave of public sympathy for Ratterman and fury toward the mob that no legitimate campaign could have produced. Ratterman won the sheriff's election in a landslide. And then something happened that transformed a local reform effort into a federal operation. United States Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, already on a personal crusade against organized crime, took a special interest in Newport. He sent dozens of FBI agents to Campbell County. What followed was swift. Within months, most of Newport's top officials were under indictment. Raids shut down the casinos one by one. There was a dark comedy to some of it. During one raid, a sheriff's cruiser parked in front of the targeted establishment came back to find a parking ticket under the wiper, a small gift from the Newport Police Department to the man shutting down their benefactors. And the men who had run the gambling, the operators, the pit bosses, the floor managers, the accountants, began to leave. Not grammatically, not in a hail of gunfire. Ratterman later described it with a kind of wry understatement. The other side knew what was coming, and they left quietly, on their own. We knew who was in charge of the corruption, and they knew we knew. Where did they go? They went where the money was legal. Mo Dalitz had already been building his next act. In 1949, when a Las Vegas promoter named Wilbur Clark ran out of money building a hotel casino he'd started with $250,000 of a needed $1.5 million, Dalitz and the Cleveland Four stepped in. They poured several $100,000 into the project, secured additional loans, and finished it at a total cost of roughly $6.5 million. When the Desert Inn opened on the Las Vegas Strip in 1950, it was the largest employer in Nevada. Clark's name was on the building, and his face was on the casino chips. But Dalitz's group held roughly 83% of the assets. The Desert Inn featured the first championship golf course on the Strip, spawned the Tournament of Champions PGA event, and drew Hollywood royalty: Zsa Zsa Gabor, Bing Crosby, Bob Hope. In 1958, Dalitz opened the Stardust, the largest hotel in Las Vegas at the time, with 1,065 rooms. Over the years, federal investigators estimated that the skim from the Stardust, unreported profits funneled to organized crime figures in the Midwest, reached nearly $100 million. Dalitz, the man who had run rum across Lake Erie and burned out a casino owner in Southgate, Kentucky, became known as Mr. Las Vegas. He helped found the Las Vegas Convention Center, the Las Vegas Country Club, and Sunrise Hospital. He received the Torch of Liberty Award from the Anti-Defamation League in 1982. He sold the Desert Inn to Howard Hughes in 1967 and died in Las Vegas in 1989 at the age of 89, eulogized as a philanthropist. The skills he had honed in Newport, managing casinos, cultivating high-rolling clientele, handling politicians, running a city within a city built on entertainment and risk, turned out to be perfectly transferable. The only variable that changed was legality. Newport, meanwhile, was discovering what happens when you remove an illegal economy without replacing it with a legal one. Ratterman served as sheriff for 4 years. He was effective. The casinos closed, the mob left. But Ratterman could not conjure an alternative economy into existence. The gambling industry had been, for better or worse, the engine that drove everything. When it vanished, so did the foot traffic, the tourism, the weekend crowds from Cincinnati, and the downstream spending at every diner and shoe store and barber shop on Monmouth Street. The population, which had stood at about 31,000 in 1950 and was still over 30,000 in 1960, began to fall. By 1970, it had dropped below 26,000, a loss of more than 4,000 people, about 13.5% in a single decade. By 1980, it was under 22,000. Retail firms in the city declined from 389 in 1963 to 290 by 1972. Service businesses shrank from 191 to 156 in the same period. And sin didn't leave with the syndicate. It simply changed its outfit. The carpet joints with their chandeliers and floor shows became strip clubs with neon signs and sticky floors. The names on Monmouth Street changed: La Madame's, Brass Ass, Chick's, Trixie Delight, Mousetrap, Cinema X. But the nature of the commerce didn't. It just got cheaper. Instead of Frank Sinatra in a tuxedo, you had nude dancers and bar girls hustling overpriced drinks in darkened rooms. Instead of well-dressed couples coming from Cincinnati for an elegant night of dining and illegal roulette, you had men in rumpled clothes ducking into peep shows. As one Newport attorney who practiced in the city during the 1970s and 1980s put it, the strip bars didn't make the town sinful, they made it sleazy. The Beverly Hills Country Club, the grand palace that Pete Schmidt had built and Mo Dalitz had seized, went through its own trajectory of decline and catastrophe. After the casinos closed, the club shuttered in the mid-1960s. An entrepreneur named Richard Schilling bought the property in the late 1960s with plans to reopen it as a dinner theater. When he refused to take the mob on as partners, they burned it again. this time on June 21st, 1970. Schilling remarkably rebuilt, spending over $3 million on renovations. He created the most successful dinner theater in the Midwest. He added a massive cabaret room that could seat 1,000. With its other banquet halls, the Beverly Hills Supper Club could serve 2,500 people at once. Weddings, proms, corporate events, romantic dinners. On the evening of May 28, 1977, roughly 2,800 to 3,000 people were inside the Beverly Hills Supper Club. Comedian John Davidson was performing in the cabaret room. Around 9 o'clock, an 18-year-old busboy named Walter Bailey was told there was a fire in the Zebra Room. He walked onto the stage of the cabaret room and told the audience to evacuate. The lights went out. The doorways became impassable. Despite the efforts of 500 emergency personnel, the fire killed 165 people. Investigations revealed a catalog of failures: no firewalls, overcrowding, inadequate exits, extreme code violations. It was the third deadliest nightclub fire in American history. Today, the site remains vacant. The city spent 2 decades in a kind of purgatory. Newport had its legitimate family businesses: Dixie Chili, the Pepper Pod, Peluso's Market, and they hung on. But the strip clubs dominated the central business district, and the political fights over their presence were vicious. In 1981, a reform city commission was elected. The following year, they passed what one local historian called perhaps the most significant city ordinance in Newport's history, an anti-nudity ordinance. Starting at midnight on October 1st, 1982, police began enforcing it. State troopers raided adult bars: the Pink Panther, the Body Shop, the Mousetrap, the Delta Street Lounge. Cinema X, which had once been the Strand Theater, a historic neighborhood movie house before it became a pornography venue, had its business license revoked. The building was razed in 1983. Today, it's a parking lot. The reinvention, when it came, was deliberate. In 1990, community and business leaders began planning a new anchor for the riverfront, an aquarium. Groundbreaking took place in November 1997. On May 15, 1999, the $40 million Newport Aquarium opened its doors and drew over 500,000 visitors in its first 2 months. In 2001, Newport on the Levee, a dining, retail, and entertainment complex, opened on the riverfront where the old Posey Flats apartments had stood. The complex was built on the levee itself, overlooking the Ohio River, with views of the Cincinnati skyline. There was a 20-screen movie theater, a Barnes & Noble, restaurants. The site that had once been a corridor for bootleg whiskey and mob money was now selling shark encounters and family dinners. The ambitions were not always met. The IMAX theater closed within 2 years. The retail stores cycled through tenants. A proposed 1,000-foot-tall Millennium Tower was canceled almost as soon as it was announced. Newport did not become the next great American city. Its population continued to decline, to roughly 15,000 by the 2010 census, under 14,000 by the latest estimates. The city's poverty rate, at over 20%, remains stubbornly high. Over half the housing stock was built before 1940. The grand architectural bones are still there, but so are the empty lots and the buildings that need work. And yet, something has quietly changed. The East Row Historic District, a neighborhood of restored Victorian and Italianate houses, draws people who want the density and walkability of an urban neighborhood without the price tag of Cincinnati proper. Monmouth Street has become what one longtime resident called an eclectic mix: a gun shop next to a yoga studio, a greasy spoon beside a craft brewery, a bicycle shop that doubles as a coffee house. The Newport Gangster Tour takes visitors through the downtown, telling the stories of Screw Andrews and Mo Dalitz, and the night George Ratterman woke up in room 314. The Brass Ass, one of the last strip clubs, still operates on Monmouth Street, a vestige of a vestige, the remnant of the strip club era that was itself a remnant of the casino era, that was itself a remnant of the bootlegging era that grew out of the saloons that served the soldiers at the barracks that were established in 1803. What makes Newport's story distinct? What separates it from every other American city that had a rough patch or a corrupt era is the pipeline. The same men, the same money, the same operational expertise that ran Newport's illegal gambling industry built Las Vegas's legal one. Mo Dalitz didn't reinvent himself when he moved to the desert. He simply moved the show to a stage where the lights were on and the audience didn't have to pretend they weren't watching. The Beverly Hills Country Club in Southgate, with its chandeliers and its floor shows and its five-star kitchen, was the prototype. The Desert Inn on the Las Vegas Strip was the production model. Newport was the rehearsal. Vegas was opening night. And here is the part of the story that makes you sit with it for a while. The Committee of 500 and George Ratterman did what they set out to do. They broke the mob. They ended the gambling. They were, by any measure, the good guys. The city's own manager, Phil Chaffordini, whose father, incidentally, was the chief of detectives who had burst into room 314 that night in 1961, said it plainly years later. What happened was, the gambling went, but the town got worse. Historically, from 1961 until the aquarium, it was a rough ride. The reformers won, the city lost. That's not a moral, it's a fact, and it's the kind of fact that doesn't lend itself to easy lessons. You can't look at Newport's story and conclude that corruption should be tolerated because it's good for business. You also can't look at it and conclude that reform is always redemption. What happened in Newport is what happens when a city's entire economy is built on a gap between what the law forbids and what people are willing to pay for. Close the gap and you close the city, unless you have something else to put in its place. Newport didn't. Not for a long time. Monmouth Street runs roughly north to south through the center of Newport, about 6 blocks from the river. In 1900, it was the commercial heart of the third largest city in Kentucky. In 1946, it was lined with automobiles and neon, the Midwestern equivalent of the Strip, a street so busy on a Saturday night that you could barely walk from one end to the other. In 1978, it was a row of strip clubs and adult bookstores, the storefronts still the same solid brick buildings, the awnings now advertising things that would have made James Taylor, Jr. reach for his musket. Today, if you walk its length, you will pass a craft distillery, Pensive Distilling, housed in a building that was once a speakeasy. And a few doors down, a restaurant, and across the street, the Brass Ass. The building is still brick. The street is still narrow. The river is still right there, just a few blocks to the north, and on the other side of it, Cincinnati, the proper city, the one that always needed Newport to be the thing it would not allow itself to be. The last time Ratterman visited Newport was sometime around 2000. He saw the aquarium, the new development, the million-dollar homes going up on Park Avenue. He said it was nice. He died in 2007 in Colorado at the age of 80 from complications of Alzheimer's disease. His New York Times obituary mentioned the night in room 314. It always would. Mo Dalitz had died 18 years earlier in Las Vegas in a penthouse at the Regency Towers at the Las Vegas Country Club, a club he had helped to build. No one mentioned Newport in his obituary either. The two cities had each other's fingerprints all over them, but neither wanted to talk about it. At the corner of Monmouth and 7th, you can buy a coffee at a bicycle shop. The building is solid, the brick is original. If you look closely at the mortar, you might notice that it's been repointed, patched, carefully, by someone who thought the building was worth keeping. That's about as much of a conclusion as Newport is willing to offer. The brick is old, someone fixed it, the street is still there.